This video is brought to you by Imprint. The post-Mao marketization of the Chinese economy enabled perhaps the greatest increase in living standards ever. By the late 70s, 40 years of Mao's brand of communism had left hundreds of millions of rural Chinese in appalling poverty. But over the next 40 years, China's rapid economic expansion, driven by a blossoming private sector, would lift more than 800 million people out of poverty. Today, the private sector accounts for about 60% of China's GDP, 80% of urban employment, and 90% of new jobs. However, in the past few years, this trend has quietly reversed, as China's economic crisis has taken its toll on the private sector, forcing the CCP to rely more and more on state-owned enterprises and government spending to meet their ambitious growth targets. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at China's unprecedented marketization, how the economy is being rebalanced towards the public sector, and why Xi Jinping might be doing this.
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos.
So, broadly speaking, China's economic history can be split into three periods. The first runs from the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1950, when the Communist Party took control of mainland China, until Mao's death in 1976. At the time, the government ran a command economy, where they told businesses what to produce and then set prices by diktat. This didn't work out so well. World Bank data suggests GDP per capita grew at about 2.7% per year, which isn't great for one of the poorest countries in the world. And this was mainly achieved by taxing rural peasants and using the proceeds to fuel industrialization. Hundreds of millions of peasants were stuck in poverty, and there were periods of catastrophe, including most notably the Great Leap Forward, when an attempt by Mao to collectivize Chinese agriculture ended in mass famine. Then, when Mao died in 1976, his successors, especially Deng Xiaoping, quickly concluded that they needed to move towards a more market-orientated economy. Broadly speaking, what we might call marketization involves three steps. The first is the liberalization of prices, which would have been previously set by the central government. This is usually combined with a steep reduction in government spending to reduce the risk of inflation as controls are lifted. The second is trade liberalization, facilitated by the withdrawal of tariffs, restrictions on foreign investment, and other trade barriers. This happens after prices stabilize, because a sudden influx of foreign goods or a sudden outflow of domestic goods could otherwise have a volatile impact on the price level. Then finally, there's privatization. This happens last because state-owned companies often play a role in stabilizing the economy while the first two steps are carried out, and because privatization is a complex process that itself requires a developed private sector. After all, you need someone who can actually buy up or replace the state-owned companies. When China began its reforms, Western officials from the World Bank and from elsewhere recommended shock therapy, in other words, speeding through these steps as quickly as possible. These reformists argued that while such a rapid transition would produce short-term economic turbulence, it was the most efficient way to get the economy back on track, citing the apparent success of the Western German economy after World War II or the neoliberal reforms imposed by Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet in the mid-1970s. The CCP weren't convinced though, and instead decided to marketize gradually. Instead of immediately liberalizing prices, they implemented a dual-track price system, maintaining a centrally planned production and price system while allowing producers to freely trade any excess output. The private sector gradually expanded, but this process took about 30 years, and even today, the Chinese state still plays a significant role in price setting. For example, the CCP has a strategic pork reserve that buys up pork when prices are low and offloads it during times of peak demand, especially around certain holidays. Similarly, when it came to trade liberalization, the CCP set up designated special economic zones in certain areas, which had lower tariffs and were deliberately designed to attract foreign investment. These were immensely successful and later played a major role in informing national policy. But even today, the rest of China hasn't fully liberalized its trade practices. China still has de facto capital controls, and whilst it doesn't have that many tariffs, the deliberate devaluing of the renminbi currency effectively limits imports. China started privatizing other state-owned companies and loosening their hold on certain sectors in the 1990s, but it wasn't until the 2010s that the private sector really took off. Private companies soon began to rival the state-owned behemoths. In 2010, private companies accounted for less than 10% of the collective market capitalization of China's 100 biggest companies, but this figure rose to a peak of 55% just before the pandemic. Xi himself would often talk about the two unshakables, referring to the CCP's apparently unshakable commitment to both the state-owned economy and private enterprise. However, in the past few years, this trend has reversed, and China's private sector has actually receded. Their share of the market capitalization of China's 100 biggest companies had fallen to less than a third by June of this year, and their share of the corporate revenue has stagnated. While this data only covers the biggest companies, where state-owned enterprises are generally overrepresented, other data suggests their experience is representative of the wider economy. This is both because the private sector is receding, but also because the public sector is expanding. The private sector's woes are sort of unsurprising. China's economic crisis has dampened domestic demand, and geopolitical tensions have discouraged international investors from investing as much as they used to. The private sector's overall share of total investment has duly fallen from about 60% in 2014 to roughly 50% today, with an exceptionally sharp slowdown in higher risk investments like venture capital, where funding has collapsed by something like 90%, causing the number of new companies to crater. Sudden and stringent regulatory interventions by the CCP haven't helped either. The tech sector has been perhaps the worst affected. After Beijing opened antitrust investigations into effectively the entire sector and disappeared Alibaba founder Jack Ma in 2020, investment collapsed, and over $1 trillion was wiped off the Chinese tech index. But the public sector has also expanded. This is in part because the CCP have had to indirectly nationalize struggling sectors of the economy. Earlier this year, for instance, Beijing gave local governments permission to buy unused land off developers, and local governments have absorbed failing rural banks. But it's largely because the CCP have responded to the crisis by doubling down on exports and high-tech industries, rather than trying to stimulate domestic demand. Without strong domestic demand, China's private sector, especially smaller companies, have struggled, which means the only way to meet Beijing's ambitious growth targets is more government-led investment, even if, as we've explained in previous videos, that investment isn't productive. Now, in some sense, this shouldn't come as a total surprise, given that, since coming to power, Xi has always been keener on what he calls mixed ownership rather than outright privatization. Nonetheless, it's a marked reversal of a long-running trend that has served the Chinese economy remarkably well over the years, and it will be interesting to see what happens next. Now, fans of TLDR, like you, care about understanding the world around them. And that's where today's sponsor, Imprint, comes into play. If you care about building a life of learning, then Imprint is the app for you. It's a brand new way to learn, built from the ground up. And seriously, unless you've used the app before, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, bite-sized, and interactive learning experience. It's the perfect antidote to a world where social media tries to keep us mindlessly dopamine scrolling day in, day out. Their library includes courses on topics like psychology, history, philosophy, finance, productivity, and many more, and quick reads that you can consume in a single setting. In fact, I've been using the Essential Philosophy Theories and Thinkers course, and it's been an excellent way to brush up on some knowledge from university that I genuinely thought I lost. With all the developments happening these days, from elections to AI to geopolitical tensions, it's been helpful to revisit some of the world's greatest thinkers. So make yourself feel better about your screen time, build a real habit of learning every day, and join the millions of people using Imprint. Plus, if you use the link in the description, the first 200 people will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know that you came from us.